Cervantes in Manchester, in conjunction with our cultural sponsor inside Meliá and La Bandera Spanish restaurant. Thank you very much indeed for coming to the House of Spain in Manchester. Today we are delighted in holding this presentation, Ramiro de Maeztu in England, given by our special guest, Professor David Jiménez Torres. David, thank you very much indeed for coming to Manchester, your city. It's for us an honor and a privilege having you be here. I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to our guest, David Jiménez Torres, to accept our invitation, and also want to welcome to Professor Chris Perrian for Manchester University, and thank you very much for being here with us en esta que es tu casa. Today is a very important day for us because we're presenting the second edition of Hispanglia, the Traces of Spain in England, a program that seeks to assert the contribution of the different Spanish historical figures who came to England through history, their legacies, and the importance of their contribution in some way to consolidate the vision shared by both countries. Today, David is going to talk about this book, Ramiro de Maeztu in England. Y para nosotros tenerle aquí siempre es un placer porque hay pocas personas con un currículum tan brillante con su juventud. La verdad es que da gusto presentar a un profesor universitario español, madrileño, que bueno, ya tuvo también su periodo de profesor universitario en la Universidad de Manchester, en la ciudad que nos acoge. Él fue profesor en el Departamento de Español de la Universidad de Manchester, con la que además tenemos muchísimas acciones de colaboración entre ambas entidades. Y además es un hombre que con su juventud pues tuvo una formación en Estados Unidos y además es doctor por la Universidad de Cambridge. Hoy día está desarrollando su actividad académica en la Universidad Camilo José Cela de Madrid, donde imparte clases en la Facultad de Humanidades. Además es un periodista, columnista del Español, también colabora de vez en cuando con Libertad Digital y realmente es un hombre inquieto que no para de trabajar. Hoy a mí me gustaría que nos hablara también al final de su charla sobre sus proyectos y también de una novela que va a sacar dentro de muy poco, que también tiene a Inglaterra como protagonista. Así que no te vas a librar, David, de que nos hable de tu novela. De verdad, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Estamos deseosos de escucharte hablar de Ramiro de Maeztu, este personaje vasco que es bastante desconocido y que yo creo que has sido capaz, gracias a tu trabajo, de conocerlo, de darlo a la luz y sobre todo de estudiarlo a él como personaje y no tanto en relación con los personajes con los que él trabajó. Y desde luego, de importancia vital saber que Maeztu pues, fue el primer corresponsal español en Inglaterra y que por tanto la visión que los españoles tenían de la Inglaterra de entonces pues estaba mediatizado sin duda alguna por el trabajo de ese periodista vasco Ramiro de Maeztu. Muchas gracias y le corresponde presentarte formalmente al que fue tu compañero y mentor en la Universidad de Manchester, Chris Perrian. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
So it's a particular pleasure to be given this opportunity very briefly to create a little bridge, really. As Francisco, as the director, has already said, David is a much missed colleague of ours here in Manchester. And when he came to us, he began to help with a project which was still continuing there of rethinking history, the history of Spain in particular, but the history of nationalisms across the Spanish-speaking world. There's another interesting link as well, the fact that David is such an interesting columnista with the digital newspaper El Español also takes us by a loop back into the beginning of the 19th century and to Liverpool and the death there of the famous Anglo-Spanish intellectual Blanco White, who had founded in London in 1810, I think, the newspaper whose name El Español, I believe, was one of the co-founders, desires to make that link back to the liberal plural thinker, Blanco White. So we've got a very strong regional connection. I hope it's strong enough, David, to bring you back actually on a permanent basis one day, but I know you're very happy where you are. Francisco quite rightly draws our attention to your fantastic book, your recent book on Maeztu and England, in which many of your own fascinations and interests come out, don't you? So here is a figure who moved with agility across many political realms and across cultures. And you too, David, I think have a fascination with the sort of meetings of minds and insurmountable disagreements between, on the one hand, radical traditions and on the other hand, traditionalist thinking. And particularly, I know you're very interested in crises. You spend a lot of your days now, I think, teaching about crises and indeed writing about crises. And this is perhaps something which, when we come to the conversation afterwards, would be an interesting thing to take up, because I imagine that you'll be talking to us about Maeztu's own particular reinterpretations of history and the way that images of the crises of one nation and one tradition can overlap with images of crisis and progress, hopefully, in another. Well, I won't take your time up anymore. Afterwards, there'll be plenty of time, I think, for questions and maybe one or two answers. And it's a very great pleasure. Let me thank also the Instituto Cervantes here in Manchester and also in London, who have a Blanco White series ongoing on similar themes here. And many congratulations to the Instituto in Great Britain for this idea of creating these links and for inviting us all tonight. Thank you very much indeed. So it's over to you, David.
Hello, you can hear me? Yes. Yes. Right, so thank you very much for everything, for your very kind introductions. Thank you very much for inviting me, Francisco and the Instituto Cervantes. Thank you, Chris, for that lovely introduction. I think there's very few cities in the world that I could be more excited about returning to than Manchester, a city that I lived in for 2 years, where I taught at the department at the University of Manchester, where I met some excellent colleagues and even better friends, and a city that I think is, and I thought while I was here, and I still think is so full of energy and talent and has so much to offer. So thank you all very, very much for being here, and thank you for the invitation. So, as has been said, my talk is going to focus on the Spanish journalist, essayist, and political thinker Ramiro de Maeztu. Apologies in advance, I had prepared some slides, so you wouldn't have to look at my face all the time, but I had a small computer disaster, so if I notice your eyes wandering towards the beautiful artwork that we have on the slides, I won't hold it against you, so feel free. So Maeztu is not a very universally known figure, so I'll just start by explaining a few things about his life and his links to the UK. Then I will look at some of the things he wrote about this country, and I will finish by drawing some conclusions about what he might teach us being citizens of the 21st century and being in dialogue in 2018 about the image that we form of other nations, and why is it that sometimes we are attracted to places that we have never been, and what happens when we actually travel to those places. So Maeztu lived in the final, who is of course that guy that you see right there, lived in the final decades of the 19th century and the first ones of the 20th. And the crucial date for our purposes today is 1905, because that is the date when he gets sent to London to be the correspondent for a newspaper called La Correspondencia de España. So prior to him, Spanish foreign correspondents were usually based in Paris, as this was the nexus of European communications throughout the 19th century, was the real hub of communications all throughout Europe, and also because French was the language that the Spanish elites spoke. English was much less commonly spoken. So this means that really before Maeztu, Spanish accounts of Britain were usually the work of travelers or of writers who spent stints of time in this country, or also of the various political exiles who ended up here throughout Spain's very tumultuous 19th century. But Maeztu was the first major figure who was sent here to report, and to report on a near daily basis on what was happening here for a Spanish audience. Am I speaking too loud? Is there too much echo? Is it fine? Yeah? Okay. Feel free to throw something if I'm too loud or something. So Maeztu arrived when he had just turned 30, so rather young, but he was already quite well known in Spain. He had achieved renown as one of the most talented of a young generation of Spanish intellectuals who were marked very dramatically by the collapse of Spain's overseas empire and by the desire to regenerate national life. His first book, which was an essay entitled Hacia otra España, towards another Spain, was really captured quite well this curious blend of socialism, Europeanism, and Nietzschean philosophy that was kind of the mark of the Spanish intelligentsia at the turn of the century. And moving to London really made sense for Maeztu for a number of reasons. He was actually half British on his mother's side, although she herself seems to have been quite estranged from her home country, and it's fairly clear that neither she nor really her sons had been to Britain, at least since the sons were born. So Maeztu had never actually been here before he took up his post as a correspondent, and he even complained in a couple of letters to his sister that his first year here was hell because he could read English perfectly, but he had never actually heard it spoken. However, the principal reason for his interest in London seems to have been of an intellectual or even political nature. The young Maeztu was very much a believer that Spain needed to embrace the processes of modernity, which for him meant two things. We know that modernity can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but what it meant for him was industrialization and making sure that the state allowed industrialization to happen. So Spain needed to have more factories, more roads, more canals, etc. And also fostering a more robust workers' movement. So it was this idea of, well, we need factories for a real working class to come together and to create a more socialistic Spain. Now, following the discourse of the time, Maeztu, in the pursuit of these goals, often recommended that Spain adopt the mindset and the values, or what he saw as the mindset and the values of Anglo-Saxon culture, which was the term that they used to kind of conflate the United States and the United Kingdom. And you see this all across Europe throughout the late 19th century and the early 20th century. There's all this sense that the UK and the US have a common culture, and this explains why they are very industrialized nations, and really when you speak about one, you're really speaking about the other, etc. Maeztu wasn't the only one putting forward this type of argument. In the final decade of the 19th century, a very large section of the Spanish public had developed a very keen interest in the ideas and the processes which could be found in other Western European nations. Again, going back to this loss of the colonies, this defeat in the war with the United States, many people had seen this as a demonstration that the country was out of step with modernity and needed to learn from more developed nations about how to thrive in the modern world. And Maeztu's very posting to London was a very good expression of this national interest. In this sense, he's very symptomatic of a certain moment in Spanish national life and in culture. He was initially meant to be here only for a couple of months, but his articles were popular enough, and he seems to have been satisfied enough with his new setting that he stayed for 15 years. So that's from 1905 to 1919. His output over that time is truly staggering. As a columnist today, I can only marvel at the fact that he averaged between 200 to 300 articles per year. That's a lot of words and a lot of and a very important output. So in the 15 years, we would be talking about 3,000 articles reporting on what was happening in London. He also wrote a play, he also wrote a work of political theory, and he also gave about a little under 20 public lectures. He also wrote for a mass audience, and this is rather significant. A lot of times when we study sort of the accounts that Spaniards have given of Britain, a lot of times, particularly in earlier centuries, we're looking at letters, we're looking at works which didn't have a very mass distribution. But Maeztu is writing at a time when newspapers are the form of communication. There's no real competitor, and even though literacy rates are still rather low, you can reach a mass audience, particularly in the cities, that way. So the three main newspapers that he wrote for during this time, because he switched among a few, reached daily print runs of between 124,000 copies and 140,000 copies. And also they reached audiences across the political spectrum. And perhaps the best proof of his success was that soon other newspapers started sending their own correspondents to London. So he was the first one here, but he wasn't the only one for very long. And if you're interested, I can talk more about some of the ones who followed in his footsteps later on. But what's also interesting about Maeztu is that he didn't just report from London. He also became very intensely involved in its cultural and its intellectual life. He frequented a number of clubs. He became a voracious reader of British journals and periodicals. He attended rallies and public talks organized by the Fabian Society. He was a very avid theater goer, and he was particularly a big fan of George Bernard Shaw, who was the great playwright of the time, and he made it a point to go to the opening night of every one of his plays. He also collaborated for a while with one of the great literary and political journals of the time, this journal titled The New Age, in which he published nearly 80 articles and essays. He became a close friend of that journal's editor, Alfred Richard Orridge. He attended the weekly gatherings he organized for contributors at the Café Royal. And at one of these meetings, he also met and befriended the poet and literary critic T.E. Hume, who is not all that well known today, but at the time he was one of the main figures in this kind of poetic avant-garde that was kind of elbowing for room in Edwardian London. And this poet, Hume, organized very famous meetings at his lover's home in Soho, and there Maeztu rubbed shoulders with authors and artists like Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, Jacob Epstein, Rupert Brooke, and Walter Sickert. London is also, this is on a rather different tone, but also rather important. It's also the place where Maeztu had his two most important sentimental relationships. So for a while, he had a rather well-publicized affair with a married British woman. And this, when I say well-publicized, it's because every single Spaniard who was in London at the time wrote about it in his memoirs. And it seems that this was the talk of the circles of exiles, of Spanish exiles here. And a few years after that ended, he met the woman who would become his wife, also a British woman named Alice Mabel Hill, who ended up moving back to Spain with him when he decided to return. So I hope what I've been saying so far gives you a sense of the importance and particularly the intensity of Maeztu's time in Britain. I've been studying sort of Spanish Anglophiles for a while, and I know of very few Spanish intellectuals before or since who had such a prolonged stay in the UK and who utilized it with such a clear didactic purpose. So who were so interested in explaining what it was about Britain that Spain could emulate and what it shouldn't. Yet all that I've said so far squares poorly with a couple of facts, and the first and more noticeable one is the fact that Maeztu was quite critical and increasingly critical of Britain during his time here. He presented a country that was deeply flawed and which was toying in his presentation with both imperial decay and with social revolution. And the second fact that is kind of at odds with this image of Maeztu the Anglophile is the fact that after his return to Spain in 1919, he became a very important figure in the nationalistic right. In fact, in one of his books, which was very influential, he argued that Spanish and pan-Hispanic identity was diametrically opposed to that of Britain and of the English-speaking peoples of the world. So if we look at his publications rather than his biography, it's hard to label him an Anglophile, at least the way that we usually think about these figures. But that's exactly the paradox or the complexity that I want to delve into for the rest of this talk. Because paradoxically, it was Maeztu's deep immersion in the British culture of his time which led him to adopt the critical discourse that many Britons were developing towards their own country. Moreover, it was the influence of British authors which led him to reject the very features of modernity which Britain embodied better than pretty much any other Western nation of the time. So in other words, what we have with him is that the more successfully anglicized Maeztu became on the intellectual plane, the more he rejected Britain as a country and as a society. So I'm going to look at this dynamic in a bit more detail now by turning to the things that he wrote about this country. Just a little bit of context for those of you who aren't all that familiar with the late 19th century, early 20th century. Maeztu arrives in London in what we now commonly refer to as the Edwardian period, right? So this is the period that goes from the death of Queen Victoria, 1901, to say about the start of the First World War, 1914. And even though we have this popular image of this period as the kind of placid last stage of the 19th century, right? The long summer, the last summer before the horrors of the First World War and then the Great Depression, Second World War, etc. The way that people experienced these years was actually a lot more, was much more full of conflict, I think, that we make, that we allow for in popular culture. These were years where British life was marked by national anxieties, by an increased tempo of events, and by growing tensions in public discourse. Many of the certainties of the Victorian age, everything from Britain's place as a world power to the relationship between the sexes, between men and women, came under attack from various quarters. And it became evident that the country had to change, that it was changing, but it was unclear what direction that change was taking. As for London itself, by the time of Maeztu's arrival, it was not only one of the largest and most industrialized cities in the world, it had also been shocked by the revelations of mass poverty in many of its neighborhoods, which had been exposed by social researchers like Charles Booth. And the result of this was a very vigorous and very visible reformist movement which sought to tackle the inequalities of industrial society, sometimes by using the tools of modernity, so sometimes by saying, well, we need to make the state larger, we need to have more experts directing roads and hospitals and public roads and public works and all this stuff, but also sometimes by rejecting modernity and by saying, well, clearly we've taking a wrong turn somewhere, and we need to go back to pre-industrial values, to a pre-industrial society. All of this helps explain Maeztu's recurring portrait of London during his time here, well, there, as an industrialized, mechanicized, hyperactive, and very large metropolis. In one of his early articles, he described it thus, and I quote, "London, with its endless railroad tracks, with its factories, with its enormous docks by the river, with its cabs, with its automobiles, with its buses, and with the million-hatted men who make their way to the city every morning," end quote. But the city's size was a source of disquiet for him. He described London often using the word monstrous, so monstruosa. He talked that it was an agglomeration of various disparate neighborhoods which together formed, quote, "an old, dirty, ramshackle city," end quote. And he also said that London was a parable for the country as a whole, as one could readily see in its streets, and I quote, "the persistence of social ills such as poverty, alcoholism, and unemployment, which are the dark stain of modern England," end quote. So he's very much, from the beginning, he's very much attuned to the fact that this is a very developed nation, it's very rich, there's lots of commerce, etc., but he's also making it a point to describe what he sees as the kind of dark underbelly of industrial society. Maeztu was also very attuned to the change and the anxiety over that change that was engulfing Edwardian society. In 1909, he wrote that, quote, "England has changed a lot, and it will change even more over the coming years," end quote. And the following year, there was a general election that took place at the height of a constitutional crisis between the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And he wrote about it in this way, quote, "These elections are unique in the whole history of the world. They have no precedent, and indeed they involve the most considerable revolution of any that has so far taken place," end quote. So Maeztu presented British society as a hyperactive and very politicized one. He lauded how much electoral activity there was here in comparison with Spain. He said that politicians canvassed much more than their Spanish counterparts, and he thought that this was a good thing. He was initially very supportive of the policies of the Liberal government led by Asquith and Lloyd George, which, as you may know, set the building blocks for the modern welfare state. He was also very impressed by the British Labour Party, which at the time was growing and which he thought was a very good example for the Spanish Socialist Party. So Maeztu, at least for a while, presented the UK, even though it had these social problems, he presented it as a model of success for Spanish progressives. He even wrote various articles proposing that Spanish intellectuals follow the model of George Bernard Shaw or of the Fabian Society in their way of viewing the relationship between intellectuals and society. But with the passing of the years, Maeztu also got caught up in the frustrations of a number of Britons at the slow progress of the more revolutionary legislation, or at its final shape when it did get passed. Following the lead of authors like G.K. Chesterton or Hilaire Belloc, Maeztu worried that the state was growing too much, that it was expanding at a rate that was preoccupying, and he was particularly worried that the expansion of the state was going to restrict freedoms without really improving the livelihoods of the majority of Britons. So he said that the state was growing for no real purpose. He was also dismayed by a couple of government scandals which exposed corruption at the highest level. And so by 1913, we see him writing in one article that the British parliamentary system was, and I quote, "in thrall to a plutocratic oligarchy, which remains aloof from any ideal other than conserving and increasing its own power, end quote. So we see throughout the years that his vision of a country where orderly progress was happening and that this was a good thing became replaced by that of an aimless nation, a country that was inching ever closer towards either a bloody social revolution or an Orwellian bureaucratic nightmare. Maeztu's presentation of Edwardian London also devoted quite a bit of attention to British women. He was particularly interested by the movement for the female suffrage, which was rather picking up steam around this time. If you've seen the film Suffragettes, then that's the London that Maeztu was living in. That's where he was, and that's what he was definitely seeing. He paid a lot of attention to it, not just because it was a very hotly debated topic in Edwardian society, but also because it was one of the most curious elements of British society for a Spaniard of the time. So you have to consider the fact that Spanish feminism was at the time much weaker and much more poorly organized than its British counterpart. And Maeztu even wrote in 1908 that suffragism was, and I quote, "for now seems like a movement that is confined to England." So this sense that this is actually British peculiarity. Women here want to vote. This was part of the discourse that he espoused at the time. And as for his own position on the issue, he wavered quite a bit. It's actually an interesting thing that we forget in our cultural memory, but a lot of the progressive circles that he was moving in were not in favor of giving women the vote, because there was this kind of sense, there was this myth that women were inherently more conservative than men, and that if you gave women the vote, they would vote conservative, and then the conservatives would win every election and you wouldn't pass real progressive legislation. And this is something that the Liberal Prime Minister at the time, Asquith, supported, and it was one of the reasons why the Liberal government was initially against this happening. And Maeztu very much imbibed this myth or this superstition. In one of his articles, he also thought that the discontent that British women were showing through vindicating the right to vote was actually a symptom of unease with contemporary capitalism. So he thought actually equality is not the issue, it's capitalism that is the problem. And in one of his articles, he told an imaginary feminist, quote, "Men, society, capitalism are throwing you out into the streets by the millions to try and make a living. And this is terrible, but it is not merely a feminist issue, but a social one," end quote. Throughout the years, though, he wavered a bit on all of this. He had a sister who was also a fascinating figure in her own right, who was very involved in the world of education, who very much vindicated educating women, and it's very clear that her influence made him realize that actually political rights for women made sense. He also wavered quite a bit on the question of British national power. And again, we must remember that by the time of Maeztu's arrival in the UK, this was the largest empire in the world, and moreover an empire which exerted something very close to world hegemony. And this clearly colored the image of Britain that was held abroad, especially in countries which had recently seen their empires dwindle, as was the Spanish case. However, the rise of foreign powers such as Germany, Russia, or the United States, and a couple of disasters in colonial conflicts like the Boer War, had led to a very intense debate within Britain over whether the country's days as a great world power were over. There was this anxiety over imperial decline. Maeztu was very interested in this issue, and he never seems to have fully reconciled this tension between how Britain was perceived abroad, so people looking at it from the outside like it's this incredible world power, and then how it was seen from the inside, this anxiety of our empire is crumbling. Also remember that this is not so far away from the the moment where nationalist agitation in Ireland and in India really picks up. So all of these anxieties are here in the air. And for a Spaniard who's coming here, you can see how he's torn between the two images of Britain. In some articles, he would declare that the UK was a decadent country, well beyond the zenith of its power, while in some others he wrote that the UK remained as mighty as ever. This was also influenced by his perception of how successful British reformists were at changing the country. So following one of the more famous reforms of the Liberal government, he would write the following, quote, "England is not in decay. She is richer, more intelligent, and more moral than ever before. England has never worked so much, has never thought with such intensity, and her public administration has never been so excellent." End quote. In this context of sort of wavering about what country it was that he was in and what it meant for Spain, it's not surprising to see Maeztu showing quite a few inconsistencies in the way that he presented English national character, which is really the sort of holy grail that every visitor to Britain at the time was kind of trying to find and then convey to their readers, right? So this is a time when people very much believe in national characters and national spirits, and there's this sense of, well, you travel to a place to explain what its national character is to your audience. Throughout Maeztu's corpus of London articles, we find a lot of variability in the qualities that he believes and that he presents as representative and constitutive of Englishness or of Britishness. And as a disclaimer, Maeztu, like I would say even a lot of Spaniards today, constantly slides between the term England, Inglaterra, and the term Britain, Gran Bretaña, or Reino Unido. There's this sense that of taking the part for the whole, and that's also why I keep referring to England, because all of his articles he's talking about Inglaterra, even though he's talking about the United Kingdom. He never seems to have made it either to Scotland or to Wales or to Ireland. In any case, there was this kind of, as I was saying, this instability about the things that he thought were representative of national character here, and he himself seemed to be aware of this. In 1908, he wrote, quote, "Once upon a time, I, as a Spaniard, envied England the power of her fleet. Later, the richness of its coal mines. Later still, the integrity of its judiciary. And later still, the idealism of its artists." So he's describing this sense of, well, I kind of fluctuate in the time that I've been here and the things that I admire and that are representative. In yet another article, he argued that what was truly representative of England was that this was the most Puritan country in the world. It was the country of religious revivals. But a few lines later in that same article, he claimed that it was actually the country of practical common sense, of economists and monetary pragmatism. And indeed, one way to view Maeztu's corpus of London articles is really as this kind of lengthy and somewhat scattershot attempt at explanation, where we can really see that he fixes the idea of England upon this variety of symbols that are mostly just what has caught his eye that day. And by the way, I suspect that this is how a lot of foreign correspondents operated then and even operate today. All of these inconsistencies changed with the First World War. So everything that I've been describing up until now, we can see a really clear break as soon as war begins. Despite his pre-war criticism of his host country, Maeztu was from the very beginning a very staunch defender of the Allies and of Britain in particular. He was one of the promoters of a pro-Allied manifesto that was signed by Spanish intellectuals, which was very important at the time. He wrote a lot about the war and its effects on his host country, and he was sent to the front at least 5 times by the various newspapers that he wrote for. He also worked with and for the British propaganda services, writing prologues for the Spanish translations of anti-German tracts, and also writing a very partisan memoir of his time at the Western Front. And I want to stress that one says these days that a journalist collaborated with a propaganda service, and it sounds terrible. But it's very clear to me, at least from researching the man, that it's very clear that he was not a pen for hire, that his participation in British propaganda efforts really were just him participating in a cause that he deeply believed in. He had a lot of friends who were fighting, who were in the army and who were in the trenches, and he definitely believed that they were defending the right cause. And the type of collaboration that he made was actually very typical of Spanish intellectuals of the time. So authors like Luis Araquistain or Ramon Pérez de Ayala capitalized on the fact that their pro-Allied opinions were very useful to the British and French governments in order to shore up their ever-precarious economic situation. It's always been difficult to make a living by writing, so if you're in a wartime situation, it just so happens that your articles, the things that you believe in, are also convenient for somebody with money, then you're more likely to collaborate in that way. So, as I was saying, Maeztu's presentation of the UK was exclusively positive during his final years in London, and he constantly uses this metaphor of a great regeneration, a country that is becoming regenerated. He wrote that the country's ills were being washed away with the blood, sweat, and tears of the struggle, and that the altruism fostered by the war had put an end to that culture of luxury and wastefulness that he had been denouncing earlier. He claimed that poverty had practically disappeared thanks to the government's decisiveness in putting people to work in wartime industries. And he wrote rapturously, and from today's perspective, even a little amusingly, about the British Army. His reporting from the trenches painted British soldiers as paragons of individualism and understatedness. He wrote that they were all fervent sportsmen. He said that they were very good at throwing hand grenades because they were very good at cricket. And he claimed, and this is just one of many quotes in his reporting that are rather amusing. Quote, he said that they were all courage, bravery, impetuousness, and tenacity towards the enemy, but all courtesy and sympathy and compassion for their own and their friends. And he also had this long paragraph where he talked about how Britain was a very calm country. People went to bed very early, and they ate very regularly, and they exercised outside in the clean air quite often. And this meant for him that people here preserved their energy for a lot longer than in other countries. And so at times of great national peril, they had a lot more energy to use against their enemy. It's a rather magical view of how war works, but this was what he wrote. It's also interesting, again, Maeztu knew full well the costs and even the horrors of war. He visited a lot of field hospitals. His friend, the person I mentioned earlier, T.E. Hume, was killed in action in 1917. But Maeztu, I think, like most Britons of the time, was compelled by the urgency of the situation and by the polarizing mindset fostered by the war to create a very simplified vision of the UK, in contrast to an equally simplified vision of the Germans. There's a British war correspondent during this time, Philip Gibbs, who was, I believe, the Times correspondent in the trenches. And he wrote something that I think Maeztu could have very well said after the war himself. So he wrote, "We identified ourselves absolutely with the armies on the fields, and we wiped out of our minds all thought of personal scoops and all temptation to write one word which would make the task of officers and men more difficult or dangerous. There was no need for censorship of our dispatches. We were our own censors." Okay, so coming to the end of the talk, Maeztu returns to Spain right shortly after the end of the war, and his later trajectory, as I mentioned, was primarily linked to conservative thought, conservative politics, and increasingly to Spanish nationalism. And this has led researchers particularly during the second half of the 20th century, to create this idea of Maeztu as this person who, as a young, impetuous man, had dabbled in being an Anglophile, and then upon reaching a mature age, decided the error of his ways and returned to the fold of Spanish tradition. But this account is problematic for a number of reasons. As we have just seen, Maeztu was, at the very least, a very peculiar Anglophile, even during his time in Britain. And moreover, the UK remained a constant point of reference in Maeztu's writings. During the 1920s and 30s, he often posed Britain as this sort of cautionary tale of modernity. He often talked about the social ills which he said were being caused by the failures of English liberalism. And he blamed thinkers like John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell for the fact that, quote, England is currently one of the countries most immediately threatened by social revolution. This is something that he wrote in the late 1920s. But again, I really want to focus on this idea that his opinions were very shaped by his proximity to certain sectors of British culture. So we know that his friend T.E. Hume also despised John Stuart Mill and Bertrand Russell. And in fact, when Maeztu was still in London and Hume was still alive, they both went to a lecture by Bertrand Russell, and apparently they subjected him to very hostile questioning during the Q&A session. So this is the crucial point then. The reasons for Maeztu's turning to Spanish tradition were British in origin. During his final years in London, Maeztu had come into contact with various thinkers who rejected the main features of modernity, which would be secularization, internationalism, industrial capitalism, the expansion of the state, and a greater tolerance for free speech and political liberty. These new British medievalists, I say medievalists because they very much vindicated the values of what they thought were the Middle Ages. They drank from the ideas of John Ruskin and William Morris, as well as from those of the Oxford movement. And over time, they developed a very curious blend of anti-capitalism and Catholicism, which in a place like Edwardian Britain was very consciously anti-establishment place to be. The rejection of industrialized modernity stayed with Maeztu for the rest of his career, and it led him to develop an appreciation of those nations who had a very tense relationship with modernity, such as his own Spain, and it led him to reject those countries which were built as the great reference of modernity, such as Britain. So, to conclude, I think that Maeztu's career and intellectual trajectory encourage us to differentiate between two processes that we often tend to lump together. The first is the image that we form of other countries, particularly when these images involve an element of desire or of rejection. And this process is often predicated on the distance at which that image is formed, and it often suffers very important and very clear tensions when that distance is either increased or reduced. The second process is this international commerce of ideas, which has always been very fluid, especially in Western Europe, and which sometimes operates on a nationally blind basis. And what I mean by that is that often we do this operation whereby you admire a certain country and you read the thinkers that you think are representative of that country, and if you agree with them, that means that you admire that culture. But other times it doesn't work that way, and sometimes you can read authors and thinkers from a particular nation without thinking that makes you an admirer of that nation. So that country's intellectual milieu can be influencing you without you developing an admiration towards it. Often when I explain this these days, I draw the comparison with the Guardian columnist Owen Jones, who some of you may be familiar with, who is actually quite widely read in Spain. And if you read Owen Jones today, you'll get this impression of contemporary Britain as hell, basically, as this terrible place where people, workers have increasingly fewer rights, etc., etc. So if you're reading Owen Jones and you come to agree with him, then you develop a very negative impression of contemporary Britain, but at the same time you're becoming very successfully anglicized intellectually by British debates and by discussions that are happening here. So what is the conclusion to all of this? I think at a local level we can take note that British intellectual influence abroad has been stronger and much more varied than we tend to assume. We tend to take it as a fact that when Britain has exerted cultural and intellectual influence abroad, it has been in sort of classically liberal sectors, when it clearly it has done so through other areas of politics and culture. And at the more general level, I think we can take note of the fact that international cultural transfers and borrowings take many different forms, and they follow extremely complex dynamics, that they have always been very intense among the nations of Western Europe, and that they exist and they will continue to exist even when we want to believe or we want to make sure that they do not. Thank you for your time. I'm, of course, very happy to, if you have any questions or ideas, comments. Sure, one and then Frank. Go ahead. So could you say it just a little louder?
The views of William Morris, is that right? But my question was, if Maeztu became more conservative, why would he listen to people who were more socialist? Because William Morris was, well, arguably quite socialist.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question. One of the things that I kind of came to realize through this research is that the legacy of William Morris is extremely varied. And as you rightly say, we tend to assume that it's mostly a legacy that kind of dovetails into 20th century socialism, but it hasn't necessarily been the case. And a lot of people read William Morris, and what they stayed with was not so much sort of generic socialism, but just this idea that modernity is wrong and it has gone wrong somewhere, and what's more important is returning to pre-industrial values. And for a lot of people that meant religion rather than some of the features that you would associate with more contemporary socialism. These are very interesting years in the British left. So there's this kind of milieu where people don't really know what socialism means in the early 20th century, and a lot of people are saying that it means different things, and a lot of these people are saying, well, it means that we need to go back to rural small communities, and we need to make our own woodwork and our own chairs and all of these things, and just live away from big cities. And some other people are saying, well, it means that we need to organize the workers in larger unions and everything. And then a lot of people kind of take different paths from that. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Frank, I think you...
I had two questions, I suppose. One had to do with whether you could tell us a little bit more about why is he sent as a correspondent, right? You said a bit about what interested him and how he saw his role, but the fact that he's the first Spanish correspondent based in Britain, I suppose most responds to certain processes or certain interests in Spain at that time. So I wonder whether you can say a little bit more about that. And the other question had to do with the fact that it's just really a question as to whether he published anything in Britain. And if he published anything in Britain, what was he writing about? was he writing about Spain? How was he presenting Spain? And at the same time, how, because of course, I mean, if the text is to a significant extent determined by its audience, how is his writing for a British public different from his writing for a Spanish public?
Very good questions. In terms of why, the first one, are you more interested in why he was chosen, or what was it about the time that made Spaniards interested in Britain? Why send a correspondent to Britain? Again, there's this context of a very strong interest in what's happening in the more industrialized nations of the world. There's also the fact that at the very moment where he is sent, there's this liberal politician called Joseph Chamberlain who is proposing tariff reforms, right? So England at this time has a policy of free trade, and Joseph Chamberlain is proposing tariff reforms where you impose tariffs on goods from anywhere in the world, except for the dominions and the colonies. And it was this idea of, well, we need to strengthen the ties of the British Empire. This is one way to stop imperial decay. It's a way to bind the empire closer together. And we abandoned this policy of free trade that is hurting us, and which had kind of become even an element of identity within British liberalism. And of course, this campaign, which didn't succeed but came quite close to, was very alarming for a lot of Spanish businessmen who did quite a bit of trade with the UK, particularly with foodstuffs, you know, oranges from Valencia, that type of thing. And so this was a more kind of sectorial interest in sending a correspondent here. Also, there is this sense that, in a way, France is the country that everybody's attracted to throughout the 19th century. And, you know, it's part of the legacy of the revolution and just this idea that, well, France is the apex of European civilization. All of the young artists want to be in Paris and everything. And that sort of changes towards the final decades of the 19th century, and particularly as France very clearly becomes not a second-rate industrial power, but industrial and imperial power, but definitely is behind Britain in that sense. A lot of people start to think, well, maybe France is not the model, maybe Britain is. And I think that that's part of that. I guess if I had to draw a parallel today, it would be like people from Spain that have maybe for the past 50 years been interested in the United States, and suddenly that interest changed towards China, right? So there's this sense of re-gearing your national fascination towards what you think is the emerging power in the world. The second question about did he publish anything in Britain? Yes, he, as I mentioned at the beginning, he wrote for this journal here, and he collected and expanded quite a few of the essays that he wrote for it into this book entitled Authority, Liberty, and Function in the Light of the War, which was, he published that in 1916, and it was this very dense work where he tried to lay out the principles for what the post-World War world should be like. So what do industrial societies need to be like after the First World War so that we make sure that this never happens again? And it's very much, there's a lot of kind of William Morris / John Ruskin in there. There's a lot of his growing authoritarianism, this sense of this, also this frustration of reformists of, we have very wealthy people in society, we have very poor people in this society, and we're introducing new laws to sort of balance it out, and it doesn't seem to be working. So he's adopting this more authoritarian sense of society being able to force people to give money, to give up their money to society through more direct taxation. That book was eventually, it had some influence in his circles. Didn't have a mass reading. He eventually translated it into Spanish 3 years later, and a lot of people didn't really know what to make of it because it's such a British book. It's so indebted to British debates during wartime. It's a very forceful book about the question of conscription. there was a huge debate in the UK about whether the government had a right to force people to go to war, whether it had a right to conscript people for the army. And there was all this sense of, well, this goes against the English liberal tradition, and we would cease to be ourselves. We would become just like the Germans if we did that. So Maeztu writes this book in part as a response to that debate. And Spaniards in 1919 are like, well, we know how that debate ended. They did it and they won the war. So why is this interesting now? It's also interesting that in that book he doesn't write about himself as a Spaniard. He rarely invokes Spain as an example of his arguments. And if you didn't look at the name in the cover, and if you didn't notice some of the Spanish turn of phrases in some of his sentences, it'd be very hard to know that this wasn't a British author that was writing. So, yeah. Go for it. Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering whether, at the actual time when he was publishing the articles, was that kind of receptive with the Spanish readership at the time, and kind of in what way?
Sorry, translations.
Yes, so you mentioned his book was translated later on.
Yes.
But at the time he was writing the articles, how was that received by the Spanish?
Yeah, it's hard to measure it's hard. That's a hard area to research, because with print culture, it's a lot easier to look at the output than because it's there. It's in libraries. I can go back and look through the newspapers. It's a lot harder to know how readers were reacting to it. So, because a lot of the time that doesn't really leave a trace. Now we would do it by looking at the comments on online articles. So that would be. Future researchers have an easier time there, but that option doesn't exist for the early 20th century. We know, for example, there's no way that he would have kept on for so long if his articles hadn't been very widely read. There's no newspaper that has ever wanted to lose money, right? And it was expensive for them to keep him living in London, which even then was already a very expensive city, and more expensive than living in Spain. So if the newspapers were willing to expend the money in keeping him there, then there was definitely a following for it. His articles were posted on the front page of his newspapers. So it was very much something that readers looked for and that they were looking forward to. We know he was also quite often requested to give public talks in Spain. So he gave quite a few in 1909, 1910, particularly about Britain. So we know that people were reading this and thought, well, this is interesting. Why don't we bring this person to give a talk about Britain more in general? And we also know that he was the conduit through which a couple of British authors of the time entered Spain for the first time. So he was the first one in Spain to really talk about George Bernard Shaw. And we know this because people would later on, his first translator, the first person who translated his works into Spanish, said that he had first heard about George Bernard Shaw from an article that Maeztu wrote. So in a lot of ways, he introduced British authors into Spain that maybe wouldn't have really reached the Spanish audience if not for him. Last way of answering your question, it's also the case that he wrote a lot about the Fabian Society, which was this kind of socialist think tank for a time, and we know that there was an attempt to form a Spanish Fabian Society in, I want to say 1908, so that's 3 years after he had been writing about it. And these people asked him to be the honorary member of the board, as kind of recognizing his role in inspiring them to form a Spanish Fabian Society. So there's all of these kind of indications that all of this was significant and that it had real repercussions in his readers.
Yeah, David, you picture an image of the Maeztu as a sort of testigo and witness, somebody who's observing and reporting what's going on. But I want, to an extent, I guess that's the reality of a foreign correspondent. But I wonder if you have identified in your research any kind of long-lasting impact of the Maeztu in the political and cultural life of the city, or among the group of expats he was sort of befriending. You mentioned that he was very much out there going to rallies. If you can talk a little bit about him as somebody who's also intervening in the local context in which he is.
Yeah. There's definitely an influence that was kind of curtailed. So there's two things that happen. As I mentioned at the beginning, he has these two very important and influential friends who are the editor of the New Age, who's this Ulrich character, and then T.E. Hume. Hume dies during the war, and if you read biographies of Hume, there's this kind of sense, he kind of has this aura of somebody who, if he hadn't died during the war, he would have really been something in terms of, he was also already very charismatic. He was very much the person who organized the British avant-garde, and if his influence would have been much longer had he survived the war. And I think if that had happened also, we would be talking today about Maeztu's influence in him, and through him in the British avant-garde as well, because Hume and Maeztu definitely saw each other as equals, and in their writing you can see a lot of borrowings from each other. I wouldn't say in any way that Hume was a disciple of Maeztu, because his personality was very proud. He thought of himself as a brilliant person. He didn't really see himself as a disciple to anybody, but he definitely borrowed a lot of ideas from Maeztu, and the two of them met pretty much every day and discussed their own ideas about art and politics. And Ulrich took a turn in his life where after becoming this very influential editor in London, then he decided to turn towards more spiritual pursuits, and he became involved in these kind of spiritistic societies. I think that kind of people that summon dead spirits into. So had that not happened, I think Maeztu's influence via Ulrich would have also been quite important. His book was read by this group of the medievalists, the people who at times call themselves guild socialists. The problem is that they didn't win the sort of war of the British left at the time, and the New Age eventually got overtaken by the New Statesman, and that became the kind of journal that was read by the British left, and of course the Labour Party became the hegemonic party within that group. So his influence, I guess I would say, was short-lived in that sense, and also kind of curtailed by outside factors. That answers them. Yeah. More questions? Valentino?
I was wondering if Maeztu, while he was living in London, went to see Picasso, Cubism. Did he have an image of Spanish modernity, and did he write about it?
Yeah, Maeztu never had much time for Cubism, and it sort of makes sense in the context of at the time that he would have been interested in it is precisely the time where he starts being influenced by this whole rejection of modernity. So if Cubism is modernity, then Cubism will also be wrong. And he had this view of art that was very much influenced by saying that art needed to be pragmatic and needed to serve a social purpose. So art for art's sake didn't make sense. And in this kind of social absolutism, this idea that everything needs to be for the good of society, Cubism didn't really fit. He saw exhibits by Picasso, Juan Gris. He traveled quite often to Paris as well, but it was one of the symptoms that he saw of illness in the modern world, and degeneration and decadence and everything. It's the same thing with poetry. He didn't have much time for surrealism or really any avant-garde. His friend Hume very much favored the return to classical verse. He's a sort of semi-T.S. Eliot figure in that sense. That's the kind of poetry that he's advocating, someone that is very linked to the classical roots of Western art, and Ezra Pound was part of that milieu as well, so that's very much what he's part of. Oh, we have a question.
You mentioned that he wrote a play. I was just wondering what it was about and why you feel that he was compelled as a correspondent to write a play.
Yeah, so the play was never staged. So he was compelled to write it because he loved the theater, and that's very clear. And he also, in comparison with painting and poetry, he saw the social function of theater. I mean, again, this is the mass spectacle of the time. There's no cinema yet, or at least it's in its very early stages. People are going to the theater all the time, and a lot of people are seeing plays, and he can look at somebody like George Bernard Shaw and say, well, this person writes a play that has a political message, and this then gets put on in front of audiences of maybe 200 people every night in different cities for months on end. So if you want art to have a social function, this is the way to do it. And I think he was definitely thinking of his play in that vein. The play is fascinating. Again, it's hard to talk about a social repercussion, as again, it was never staged, and the text was salvaged after his death by his son. It's fascinating for somebody who's looking into Maeztu because it has a kind of snapshot of how he felt about Britain, because the plot is these 3 citizens from a fictitious Latin American republic that travel to London. And it's what they see when they arrive here, and what the whole play kind of follows them as they deal with people in British high society. And everything that I was mentioning before about his sense of British society as a place of this very unequal distribution of wealth, and sense that the upper classes were frivolous and they spent their time, instead of in helping other people, they spent it in automobiles and in dresses and all of this stuff. All of this definitely comes through in the play. And the play definitely has a message of the Spanish-speaking nations of the world need to take what's good from Britain and then be prepared to defend themselves from Britain and from the decadent aspects of modernity. So these nations need to become, the Spanish-speaking